Welcome, everyone, and thank you, Melanie, for the introduction. My name is Brandon Heideprim. I've been working with Dynamics SL for about 12 or 13 years now. My expertise is around SharePoint, Business Portal, and Web Services, and that's what we'll be covering today is the Dynamics SL 2011 Feature Pack 1 Web Services. For those that are maybe new to Web Services, there have been a couple deliveries of them. We'll be talking about the latest one that include project time and project expense entry. So today's agenda, we're going to be talking about web services. What are they? Going over the installation of the SL web services, the administration of them, how do you connect to them. We'll also go over the provided web services provided by Microsoft, as well as how to extend those web services, including creating your own custom web service. So what are web services? Web services are a way for multiple applications to be able to talk to each other using an open format. Typically, in the past, most applications have their own proprietary ways of passing communication. An example in Dynamics SL is transaction import, or TI, where you need to have files in specific formats and be able to import that data in using that application. With web services, it's an open format, and most applications will know how to communicate with it using XML as the basis for the web service. So the web services help solve interoperability problems by giving different applications a way to link their data. So with Dynamics SL, how do you install them? There's a couple things you need to know before you do install. Windows authentication is the mode that you need to have your Dynamics SL databases in, as well as it needs to be hosted on SQL Server 2008 or 2008 R2. And IIS needs to be 7.0, and it needs to have the secure socket layer enabled that makes everything secure with HTTPS instead of HTTP, as well as having some other sub-features installed like Windows Process Activation Service, Windows Communication Foundation, Microsoft .NET 3.5, SP1, as well as making sure that you've registered the module, the web service module in Dynamics SL. To install web services from the main installation page of Dynamics SL, you'll see at the very bottom under Additional Products, you hit Microsoft Dynamics SL Web Services. Click that link, and it will bring up an Install Shield Wizard. On the first screen of the Install Shield Wizard, it's just letting you know you're installing web services. The second screen will let you choose your SQL Server and your system database. One item to note right here is that the web services can only be installed to one system database at a time. So if you do have multiple installations with system databases, you can have multiple company databases in one system database, but if you have multiple system databases, it can only be pointed to one system database at a time. So here you're going to select your SQL Server, and then you'll select your system database and click Next. On the next screen is where you get to choose which web services would you like to install. By default, Web Services Framework obviously is going to be installed, as well as you'll need to choose one authentication method, which we'll talk more about in detail here. But in this instance, in this example you can see on the screen, the login windows is the one selected, as well as the Lookup Customer Project, Project Expense, and Project Timecard web services will be installed. Now the text boxes on the right are pointing to an IIS website that you created prior to running this install. Upon clicking Next, you get to the last screen to be able to install SL Web Services. When it has successfully completed, you'll then want to go to a URL that you can see at the top of the screen here, where it's HTTPS, your server name and port number that would map to the IIS site that you created, and then it would go along to any of the services. And when we say services, these are web services and also Windows Communication Foundation services. So in this instance, what I have up here is the Microsoft Dynamics SL Web Services session.login Windows service. And you can see that the service is created. If you get to the screen, it's created, it's up and running and working correctly. And then the second red box you see down below is a URL that you'll want to use when you're in Visual Studio to create a reference to the service. So I'll show you a little bit later as you create references to these services so that way you can call them. And the bottom red box is what you're going to want to note for use later. Now, administration. In Dynamics SL now, there are a few new screens as well as tabs located throughout the administration area. The first one is Access Rights Maintenance, as well as Web Service Method Maintenance, Web Service Lookup Security, Trusted Web Service Account Maintenance, Web Service Lookup Maintenance, as well as Access Rights Report. So the first thing you want to do is the Trusted Web Service Account Maintenance screen. This is where you're going to go and you're going to add the user, what account has full access and is trusted to the web service account. Next is the Web Service Method Maintenance. From this screen, you're going to be able to add or remove methods that users can call on your web services. Web Services Lookup Security is going to provide the ability for people to do lookups based on their access to the web service method. Now, this can be quite confusing, so I'm going to make sure I try to say this a couple times so people can understand. You provide users access for your users to a given web method. In this instance here at the top in the red box, you'll see that it's called, on the customer service, there's a method called read customer. So once you've given a user that they're allowed to read a customer, now what lookups are they also allowed to call? So a lookup is kind of like a PV inside of the 32-bit application. So if, in this instance here, if a user has access to read a customer, they also have access to the lookups on the right-hand side of the screen, account category list. So that way you don't need to assign the permissions for every user, for every lookup. You just assign permission for a web method. So if they can read a customer, they can now also do the 5 lookups on the right-hand side of the screen. Web Service Lookup Maintenance, where we're just talking about the lookup methods that are available. This is where you maintain those web service lookups. Now, a web service lookup, in reality behind the scenes, is accessing a view or a stored procedure. So you can see on the screen, the very top one, account category list. That's the name of it. It has a description as well as a procedure, and that is actually pointing to stored procedures inside of SQL in the application database. As you'll see when we could talk about this a little bit later, the lookups are weakly typed data, so you can modify the stored procedure to add or remove different data or add additional restrictions. And it will not break anything because when the data comes back from the web service, it's weakly typed. It comes back in a data set, and you can just access the data in a data row. So now you can create your own custom lookups by just creating a new stored procedure, adding it into lookup maintenance, adding security, and your users will be able to get that data through the web service. In addition, there's a new access rights report. It's a new report you can run that will show all access that users have to the web services. I have an example that will come up here on the screen. In this instance, it's showing the administrators and the sysadmin on what access they have to the web service and their access rights to the web method and whether they have access, yes or no. So once everything is configured and you've had multiple users and you've added the lookup security, you can run this report and ensure that you've set security correctly, or be able to look back on why a call to a method fails. Now that we have it installed and we've configured the administration of it, now how do we connect to it? There's two different types of authentication modes that Microsoft has provided. The one is login windows, and the second one is login forms. So with login windows, obviously that's connected to a Windows user. So when you're running your application that is calling Microsoft's web services, it is passing along who you are when you're logged in. So if you're logged in with your domain/username, it'll pass that along. It'll authenticate that against an SL user and use that SL user as it accesses data. Login forms is doing forms authentication where it goes against a username and a password. So you'll actually have to pass that in, with the username and password. And that's why it's recommended to only use secure socket layer, HTTPS, because in this instance it's going to be passed a username and a password on the wire or on the internet across there, so you want to ensure that's secure. Now with these two, login windows and login forms, you can install both and have both enabled, but only one of them is really needed. Typically it's going to be the login windows that is going to be used. And with login windows, it uses the immediate user as that session user. And if that user is part of the trusted service account that I showed you on the one administration screen, they also have the ability to work on the behalf of other users. So if my user, domain/username, is a part of the trusted service account, I can log in and I can work on behalf of other SL users when I'm connected. So we'll see when we talk about the project expense and project time, that when we want to enter in expenses or time, we'll have to work on the behalf of other people, because you can only enter time or expense for the logged in user. Now login forms, like I said before, requires credentials that we passed over the wire, so make sure and ensure that you're using secure socket layer to do that. So when you log in, whether it's Windows or Forms, it's going to give you back a unique ID called a GUID. That unique ID is something you'll need to keep track of and pass into all your web methods when you make calls. Once you're authenticated and it gives you a unique ID, you pass that in so that way it knows who it is that's making this web call and that you're authenticated, yes or no. So one thing that you have to do is with that a unique identifier is it has a session that at some point it'll be invalidated so it no longer works. So there's a couple of approaches that Microsoft has for how to do that. Once you start your session and you're calling different web services, every now and then you might want to call a ping method to ensure to keep your session active. The second way that Microsoft recommends is to log in, get your unique identifier, make your one call, and then log out. So that way you can ensure that you're always actually connected and you haven't timed out. So it's something you need to take into account as you're designing the architecture of your program. Now I'm going to flip over to my virtual machine and show you what I have set up with IIS, the application pool, and a couple programs to show you how easy it is to actually connect with Windows Forms and login forms. Here's my IIS site. Well, before I installed Microsoft Dynamics SL Web Services, I created a new site called SL Web Services. With that, I created a new application pool as well with the same name. Now, to note with the application pool, you need to have it under .NET Framework 2.0. The pipeline needs to be integrated, as well as its identity needs to be able to have full access to the machine itself. It needs to be a machine administrator. There is logging that takes place on this machine to text files, and it needs to be able to have enough permission to write those text files out. So you may remind or just remember to create the IIS site and the application pool prior to installing SL Web Services, and then you will point the web services to this IIS site. What we have here, this is a Visual Studio console application, and you can see here, I'll make the text just a little bit bigger. With a few lines of code, you'll see at the top we have a login Windows service client, a login Windows context, and in about 8 lines of code, we can set our company ID, the culture, which is English US, and then log in and get back a GUID, which is our unique identifier. And that's all. Those 7 lines of code is all that is needed to connect into the login Windows, get back our unique identifier, and then we can make calls into different web services. You'll see it towards the middle of the screen there. Here, what we're doing is we're doing a find customers, and for each customer, we write it out to the console. And then below that, you can see that we close our proxy, we log out of our session, and we close our session. So you can see here in 15 lines of code, we connect to one web service to log in and get our session ID. Then we call the customer service, find all the customers, do something with all the customers, and then log out. This is the basic framework that you will use for login Windows and login forms, as well as all the customer project, etc. web services throughout this. Now I'm going to show you the login forms example. Login forms is very similar. But there is one difference, and that's what I want to point out, and why we're going to bring this up and look at it. You can see here that the code is very similar. The only difference is, other than we set company ID, same as before. We set culture, same as before. Now we have to actually set an SL username and an SL user password, as I mentioned before. But all the other code in here will be the same. So once you have identified your authentication mode, then you can configure it in here, and the rest of the code will work to connect to the customer service, iterate through all the customers, and close and log out. So now we've gone through installation, configuration, and connecting to web services. So now what we'll cover is the actual web services provided by Microsoft for Dynamics SL. The customer web service. The customer web service has a hierarchy, and there's two sets in the customer hierarchy. There's customer and customer activity. As you can see in the diagrams, customer is the parent and has 3 children under it. Customers have contacts, shipping addresses, and customer EDI information. Now, customer activity has 3 children below it as well, with customer history, customer balances, and receivables summary documents. So when you're going to call and get information, you're going to call in and you're going to ask for customers. Then you're going to tell it whether you'd like it to bring back the contact information, its shipping addresses, or the additional children information with your call. Now, the customer web methods that are available is your basic CRUD operation. CRUD stands for create, read, update, and delete. So with most web services that we're going to cover, they're going to have your CRUD operation, as well as the ability to find customers and to default to customers. Now, find customers is very similar to in SQL when you're doing your where clause, where you want to get all customers where something equals something, and you're able to do that inside the web methods to get back all customers where equals your clause. Once you get back that customer, then you can be able to update it, delete it, read other children information, etc. The default customer web method, what that does is sets default values for properties that were not set by you. So if you're going to create a new customer, you get a customer object, you may set its name, some addresses, some other information about the customer, but there may be some default information that's required on the customer object to be created inside of the database. So you pass your object to the default customer web method. It'll give you back the same similar customer object, but all the defaults will be set for you. So that way when you actually call to create it, it won't fail out because you missed an important value. Now with the customer activity web methods, there's only the ability to read them and find them. The CRUD operation is not there for customer activity. Customers have the ability to have notes, so that is as well available inside the web services to be able to create system notes. And this is your CRUD information: create, read, update, and delete. As well as one of the new features in Dynamics SL is the ability to do attachments to items. So customers have the ability to do a system attachment. So you can do a create, read, update, and delete, as well as getting the system attachment location. If for some reason you need to know where those attachments are located, you can get that information, as well as doing all the CRUD operation for an attachment to a customer. So customer web services expose customer SO address, contact, and customer EDI database tables in SQL. Customer activity exposes customer, AR hist, AR balances, and AR doc. And those are the tables inside of the application database that the web services expose. So we talked about finding customers and be able to do a where clause. Well, how you do that is you do it through a filter. So what we have here, and I glossed over it in my Visual Studio example, but maybe we'll look at that again. What you do is when you want to do a find is you create a customer filter. There's different properties in there where you can set. The very first property here is called customer restriction, and that is a string type where you can set where state equals Ohio, and it will bring back all customers where their state equals Ohio. So that's where you're going to do your where is in the customer restriction, as well as some other information, other properties that you can use when you're doing your where clause. You can do an order by, a page number, and a page size if you'd like to do paging in the data. If the data set is going to be very large and you'd like to do it in a size of 10, then you can set your page size to be 10, and it will return back 10 records at a time. Or if you specify 0, then it will return all the results. Now, we talked about the customer was the parent, and it had children below it, like customer EDI data, the customer contacts, as well as shipping addresses. Well, when you're doing a find, it by default will not bring back the children data. But inside this filter, if you set it to true to give me back the customer EDI data, then it will bring back all the children data as well. But by default, it sets it false and will only bring back the customers. As well as inside here, with the children, you have the restrictions available to set where clauses for the children. So you can say, give me all the customers where the customer contact equals, and you can do your where clause there. And you'll find that as we walk through customer and project and the other web services, that this basic setup of having notes, attachments, filters, they're all basic framework is there for all of them, just the properties are a little different based on the entity type. Customer activity also has a filter that's the same basic layout. Customer activity has a restriction, order by, page number, and page size, as well as it has the ability to return children data and do restrictions on children data. Project web service. The project hierarchy consists of project fields, billing fields, project maximums, has addresses, project team members, and a collection of tasks. So here on the screen, we have a visual example of that hierarchy. where project is the parent, and below project is the billing information, project maximums, addresses, tasks, and employee team members. And then tasks has children of its own called task maximum and task employee assignment. So the web methods available for project are your basic CRUD operations, as well as find projects, get project defaults, which we've seen the find and the defaulting in customer. But in addition with project, it has get next flex key. There's a web method for project flex key to get your next flex key, because based on your segments, that when you're building a new project, you have multiple segments that you can define, and that's flexible. What this does is be able to give you back the next, the logic searches for the last segment field that's numeric, validates that, and then increments it, so it gives you back the next available project ID. So what you need to do when you're creating projects, and this is the same with customers, is the ID field for project and customer, you're required to set. The system does not create it for you. You need to set it on your customer or your project object when you pass it in to create. If you do not set that field, that it will error out, it will not create it. You need to set your customer ID, the project ID, otherwise it will not be created. As well as the Project Web Services has the ability to add notes, has the ability to do a system note and a PJNote. And all the create, read, and update deletes are there for both notes. As well as Project has the ability to do the attachments. Has the ability to do the CRUD operations, as well as getting the attachment location of where those attachments are stored. Now the project filter is very large in this because there's so many child objects below it to be able to return back the child data, as well as doing the restrictions on the child data. So this project filter is the same as the other filter, the customer filter, just for project information. So the objects that are exposed from the database inside of project are as listed here: PJProj, PJBill, PJAddress, all the PJProj extensions, PJPent, which is the task information, as well as the task extension tables. Now project also has financials that are available for you to pull out of the SL Web Services. Very similar to what we've seen with customer and project. Project financials is the parent. It has actuals, commitments, summaries, and some task children below it. And task financials has a couple children below it. So you'll see I'll probably go a little bit faster as we go through a couple of these web services here. It's the basic framework I set before. With the web methods, you have your filters and the objects that are exposed. So with project financials, you obviously can only read and do find on that information. Since you can do the find, you're going to have a filter available. This filter here, you can see the properties are a little bit more because of returning all the children data and doing restrictions off the children data. Here's a listing of the tables that are exposed by project financials. Project account roll-up, the different roll-up, the tasks, the task summaries, PTD sums. So if you need any information on these, you're going to want to go to the project financial web methods. Project budget web service that has the ability to do direct budget and budget revision. So you can see here on this screen, there's a project direct budget, and then below it has the direct budget line. So the project direct budget has things like project ID, your description, status, managers, start and end dates, and then direct budget where you're going to have the task budget lines. So for project direct budget, we have the ability to read the direct budget, post direct budgets, and find direct budgets. As well as it has the filter to be able to do your restriction, get back your budget line data, and do a restriction on the budget line data. The objects that are exposed for project direct budget are listed here. PJ Proj, PTD sum, Rev header, Rev task, and Rev category. The budget revision hierarchy has budget revision with child of budget revision tasks, and below that, the budget revision categories. So I'm kind of speeding up here with a lot of this project information, as there's not as much available, and it's the basic framework. So once you've kind of understood the first framework, you can be able to understand that you can get to this other data. The important pieces with each web service is just acknowledging what methods are available and what tables they do go against. So the top level of this one is project revision, and the level below that, budget revision task, which is the task level information, has a collection of tasks there. And then from each one of those tasks, it's going to have the account category lines associated with that task. Now the methods available here does have the create, read, update, and delete, and the find budget revision, as well as the filter information that's available for the budget revision. So now we'll talk about the two new web services available with Feature Pack 1. Project expense entry will be the first one. So with expense entry, you're going to have an expense header, and you're going to have the expense details as the child object below that. Project expense has create, read, update, delete, find, default, and create expense detail. This web service is slightly different that you'll see. When you create your project expense, you're going to create your header object. Inside of your header object, you have the children data, which are your expense details. You can create those all together, as in you can create your header and your detail all at once, or you can create your header separately from your detail lines, and you'll use create expense detail when you've already had a header created and you just want to maybe add more detail lines to it, and you already know the document number. And you can do that with create expense detail. Expense entry has the ability to add system notes, CRUD operations, as well as getting the attachment location. Expense entry has the ability to do PJNotes as well. I'm hesitating here. I see that the audience view is slowing down slightly, and slowly, looks like it's slowly catching up now. So I'm sorry if I'm going too fast for the view taking place here. So I mentioned PJNote, the ability to do CRUD operations for project notes. And the objects that are exposed, the PJ expense header, the PJ expense debt, and the PJ notes are the database tables available. Project expense also has its filter to be able to do expense restrictions, order by, page number, page size, return the detail data, and a restriction off the expense detail data. Now, one important thing to know with expense entry. Each SL user ID must be linked to a single employee inside of employee and resource assignment. So this ensures to make sure that the user can only access the expense information in the web service for the specified project employee. So as I mentioned in the login windows, when you log in and you log in as, I log in as myself, Brandon, domain name / Brandon, I can only do create, read, update, deletes, find, anything on expense items that are mapped to myself. So even if I try to do a find for a different user, if I try to do a find and expense for a different user, it will not give me back that data. Now the one thing you can do is when you're logging in, I can still log in as Brandon, but I can use it on behalf of property when I log in. So I can log in on the behalf of another user. As long as Brandon is a trusted account inside of the configuration that I showed you earlier, then I can log in as other people, and then I'll be able to bring up, create expense items for them, find expense items. But it's just one thing to note. that you can only access your information unless you're working on the behalf of another individual. Project time card entry. As you can see here, that we have the time card header that has time card details. With the header, you have the ability to do attachments, S-notes, project notes, as well as the time card details have the ability for the same. Project time card entry works the same way with what I just mentioned about you can only access your own time or expenses unless you're working on the behalf of someone else. Project time card has create, update, read, update, and delete, as well as a find to get that information. The additional web methods with this one is the ability to default, which we've already talked about, and the ability to correct. So you can create a correcting time card hierarchy that consists of the original time card header and all the detail lines, and this includes corrections. So we have the CRUD, we have the defaulting, we have the ability to create a time card detail, very similar to expense entry. The one extra method here is correcting time cards. Time card entry also has the ability to do system notes, create, read, update, and delete, as well as do system attachments as a create, read, update, delete, as well as getting the system attachment location for time cards. Time cards also have the ability to do PJNotes, as we mentioned before, to create, read, update, and delete. And the database tables that are exposed with Project Time Card Entry are PJLab Header, PJLab Det, and PJNotes. Project Time Card also has the filter to do the time card restriction, order by, page number, page size, return back the detail lines, as well as do a restriction on the detail lines. When I put the same slide in here for time card entry that I just mentioned, one SL user applied to one project employee, and you can only access your own information. All right, so now we're going to go back to Visual Studio and look at a little demo of creating some customer information and how we can access the customer web service a number of different ways, and I'll show you the code for that. All right, I'm opening Visual Studio. I can see that we have the little bit of delay in the audience view. Gonna make the text a little bigger here. All right, I think the view is caught up. So what we have here is the basic code that I showed you before, the ability to do login windows. Here you can see in the middle of the screen where my mouse is. I click on it, double click on it. You see on behalf of property. This is the one where I was talking about where for project time and project expense entry, you'll want to use this. The one catch that's different, slightly different from Business Portal when you're doing that. We mentioned SL user has to be mapped to one project employee. If you have Business Portal users that are not SL users, they're just project employees, you will need to create a SL user for each user you'd like to be able to access the web service. Create a SL user for them, map them in project employee maintenance, and then you can be able to have someone log in on the behalf of them to create expense reports or time cards for them. So we log in. You can see here that we get back a session GUID, and then we're doing a method here. The method name is do it. So if I scroll down, what this little console application does is when it runs, it says, hey, what do you want to do? And there's multiple different things we could do. We can create customers. We can read customers. So I just want to go over some of the code. I'm going to make it even bigger here to make sure everybody can see it. In this example, you can see right here in the middle of the screen, this is how you create a customer. You just get a new customer. You set its name. You have to set a customer ID. And you can see here, customer ID is a required field, as well as these other fields that I've set some values with. Last updated program, created program, and terms ID are all required fields. If you do not set terms ID to a valid value, when you call create customer, you will get an error. If you don't know what valid terms ID are, that's what you're going to use the lookup service for. You can call and ask for a listing of all terms IDs. It'll get you back the valid values for that, and then you can select one and set it on terms ID here, and then be able to create your customer. Okay, I'm going to scroll down and show you a little bit about how can you read customers. So first thing you're going to want to do is create a customer filter. And within that customer filter, you're going to set things like return customer contact data, and that's going to set it to true or false. Return shipping address data, true or false. As well as you can set that customer data. Let me scroll down a little bit more just to show you. Filter information. On the filter, you can set a customer restriction. As you can see here in the middle of the screen, we have where customer ID is like C, so we'll return back all customer IDs that have the character C in the either before, middle, or end of the character string. So you can set all the customer filter information, and then you call find customers, you pass in the filter, you pass in your unique identifier, and it'll get you back a list of that information. Here in the middle of the screen, what we have is how you can update a customer. As you can see here, the first thing we do is we read to get a customer. We pass in the customer ID and the unique identifier. It gives us back a customer object. We can change that customer object. In this example, we're changing the name to a different name. And then we pass that customer object back to the web service in the update customer web method, passing our unique identifier. And as you can see here, it's actually only 3 lines of code for us to get the customer, change its name, and update it inside of the web services. All right, I'm going to switch back over here to PowerPoint. We have a few more things to cover, and we have about 10 or 12 minutes, because I'm going to leave time at the end for anyone to ask questions. Moving on to the Lookup Web Service, and I've kind of mentioned this web service a few times, but just to clarify, the Lookup Web Service is kind of a helper web service where you can call in to get additional list information and just be able to look up different things. And I mentioned before, like terms ID. And what the Lookup Web Service does is you call and you say execute a certain lookup, and that lookup maps back to either a view or a stored procedure, which will return back a data set, so that you can return back any amount of data in any format, however you want to do that inside of a stored procedure. That way you can get data, custom data, or the built-in lookups, and be able to look at that information and use it in other places. Now, the lookup web methods that are available are execute, the very generic method where you're going to pass in actually the string name of the lookup that you want to execute. There's a web method called exists to actually check to see if a web method, a lookup actually exists. As well as the lookups also do support the other filters with page size, page number, order by, and accepts multiple parameters. Now remember, lookups have its own security inside of lookup method maintenance, so you can set up lookups, and you assign those based on the web method. So here's an example of some lookup web methods that are available by default. This is just a short list. Account category list is the top one. It goes against the PJ account table. And there's just a handful, and if you need access to these, there's a web services.pdf that list out all the lookup names and all the tables or views or stored procedures that they go against inside of that PDF. I'm going to skip over the little demonstration of the Lookup Web Services at this time. Due to time constraints today, I want to make sure we can cover all this information, have time at the end for questions. So we walked through all the web services, and one thing about the filters that I haven't gone into details is how would you do something like that. I showed a little bit inside the demonstration, but filters support equal, does not equal to, greater, less than, greater than or equal to, less than or equal to, and also the like filter. So you use the property name, any of those operators, as well as a value. So you can see it at the below in this screen here, in this PowerPoint slide. In the service proxy, they do a read, and there's doing where sequence equals 0001. And then you can use and or operators as well. Very similar to doing SQL queries with the where clause. As well as you have the ability to add custom data to anything, any entity as it goes across. One thing we haven't exactly talked about yet, but Bill wanted to do some eventing and to extend the web services that are already there. But there is a custom data property that is available on every entity. And what that custom data property is just a data set. So that means it has tables and rows inside there. So in your eventing, you could get additional data, put it into the data set, attach it to the customer object, and it would go back to the caller of the web service, so that way they could have that custom data as well. Now, we've talked a lot about the hierarchy with parent and children objects. With that child subcollection, it has a method, a property on it called action type. So what happens is when you're creating an expense entry and you have expense details and you pass in that header and details into the web service, on those detail lines, you need to tell what action should it take on those detail lines. If you do not set any action type on the children to tell it to create, it won't know to create those because it's passing a lot of data. The web service doesn't want to have to walk through all the children all over the place to try to compare every field to know if it needs to update it, delete it, what does it need to do to this child sub-object collection. So you need to set the action type to create, update, or delete. This screen here is talking about defaulting values. Some fields cannot be defaulted. Some fields inside of the objects, like the customer object, they'll have read-only fields. If the field's there and you're able to set a value on it when you pass it into create, but when you get it back, it might be a different value. Because some fields cannot be defaulted, some fields cannot be set because of read-only. And you can use the documentation to find out which fields those are. Now, one thing what you do when you do call create for an object, and let's say you create a customer and you call create, it's recommended that you do a find off of that customer ID to go get the ID freshly out of the database in case something changed. Because one thing that can happen, we'll talk about here shortly, is with eventing, is other people can modify your object on the way in or on the way out of the web services. The second piece in here is talking about key fields. Consumer must provide a value for the key or else your create will fail. But there are some key values where you cannot provide a value or else the create will fail. Use the documentation to understand on which objects that would be relevant to. When setting up your Windows Communication Foundation services, you may find that when you're passing large amounts of data, you get message size error. So what you want to use is use this service editor, service configuration editor that I'm showing here on the screen, where you're going to connect to your web services and you want to change your message size to a very large value. You can see on the right-hand side there, they have max buffer size and max receive message size set to a very large value. If you're passing a large amount of data, if you don't change this because the number is slightly lower, if you don't do this, then you'll start getting message size errors. Microsoft Dynamics SL also provides a logging where there is the ability for them to write out information to a folder, and that's why the application pool identity needed to have access to the machine so it can write out this web service log information. Inside of the web services, there is a web.config. Inside that config file, you can set the logging level 1, 2, 3, or 4, depending on what information you'd like web services to log into those text files for you. 1 being critical, 2 being a warning, 3 being information, and 4 being write out all events that take place, even if they're not errors or warnings. Write everything out because something's going wrong, and you can set that level from 1 to 4. And it'll write all that out in text information. Dynamics SL also provides enumeration values that are in there. For an example is for a time card entry. In your header field, you have a status. You don't have to set status to a string value where someone mistypes the word in process. Instead, there's enumerations that exist that show the possible values. So you can set that status to one of these enumerations, so that way it's definitely set to in process, completed, or approved without any user errors possibly creeping in with string characters. Now, some custom development that you can do is the ability to extend a web service, which is called event handling, and you can create your own web service. Extending a web service means that there's eventing that takes place that you as a developer could jump into. So you have a pre-event and a post-event. So what that means is, actually I'll go to the next screen here, a pre-event for the customer web service. So the web method create customer has a pre-event and a post-event. So before, when a consumer would call to the web service to say create this customer, your code could jump in there before it actually goes into the database, maybe possibly read the data, manipulate the data, change the data, would go into the database, as well as there's a post event. So after it's saved into the database, then your code could jump in at that point and do something after the data was saved. So this is what's called eventing. And with every web service and the different web methods, they have different events that are available, as you can see on the screen. In the example at the top, customer web service has create, update, and delete, which have pre and post events. Read only has a post event, as well as find and default have no eventing available. Each web service has their own events that are available. In this example, project expense entry has some pre and post events for some of their web methods. And how you can add an event, you're going to write code that sits inside of a DLL, a compiled dynamic link library, and then you're going to put it out in a certain location and modify a config file. So all you have to do is write a little bit of code, which I can show you here in a minute, put the DLL in a certain place, put the compiled file in a certain place, modify this configuration file to let it know that this custom code is out there, and then it'll be able to attach itself into events. So I'll show you that real quick here. It's pretty neat for the simple fact of something that you can jump in between calls that are taking place. With very little code. Let me make this a little bit bigger on the screen here. So I know this might be getting kind of techy at this point, but there's only a couple things you have to do right here. As you can see, we're overriding a subscribe to event type, a method, and we're going to tell it what types of events do we care about. As you can see here, the pre-create customer event and the pre-update customer event. So that there's two events that are going to get called, and when they get called, it's actually going to call into our code right here. So before a person is allowed to create a customer, it's going to call this code right here. When it calls this code, we're going to get that actual customer object. And then in this code example here, we're going to set a value to user1, and we're going to change the name. And that's all we have to do. And now we've been able to have customizations to set in between the consumer and the actual SL database, so we can make modifications, we could do validations, we could stop the customer from being created, we could do lookups on something to see if they're past due. So all it takes here is 10 lines of code, and you can have a custom code running in between in your event. As well as you can create your own custom web services that are similar to customer and project, as well as time and expense entry. Microsoft's provided a couple tools. One of them is called the Domain Object Generator, the dogen.exe, where you can use it to help generate the classes needed to create a web service and use Dynamics SL's framework to be able to have your own custom web services. The dogen will point at a SQL table or view and generate all the objects. In an example like the customer web service, it creates the customer object and all the business layers that sit below that. It's actually a three-tier architecture with domain objects, data access objects, and data transfer objects. So they do give you a few tools to create your own custom web services for tables that are not currently created by Microsoft. So in conclusion, we've covered installation, configuration, administration, how to connect to the web services, what web services are provided by Microsoft, as well as the ability to do some custom development inside of there. If you want to know more about it, there's a PDF that's out there called webservices.pdf that shows a lot of information from an SDK side, as well as they provide samples, and those can be found in a Dynamics SL/Web Service Sample folder with inside of the installation package. So if you do have any questions after this, because I know that we only have a few minutes left before 3, and I'm sure everyone has a busy day, if you have any questions, feel free to email msdynamicsevents@gmail.com. Anything related to the webinar today or the content, or if you had additional questions you don't get to ask today, ask those there, and we will definitely get back with you. I was checking chat here to see if there was any questions. Melanie, if you have any, feel free to speak up.
Thank you, Brandon. As a reminder, if you have any questions, please feel free to submit those using the questions pane on your GoToWebinar console, and we will address those here with Brandon in the time we've got remaining.
Yeah, if you have any questions, I've actually created solutions that are out there that are in place and working against many of the web services that we've talked about today. I've been the architect and developer and provided support after. While Microsoft Dynamics came out a little bit later with the web services and maybe some of the other Dynamics lines, it's definitely improving as each release came out. The Feature Pack 1 release made some changes to web service, definitely much better. And if you're looking to do some development on it, this is definitely the platform to do it on. Documentation isn't as detailed as maybe the 32-bit application, because there is only really the one PDF available with the samples. But if you guys have any questions beyond what you find inside of there, please feel free to email us at the email address you see on the screen, and we definitely can help you. So if you have any questions, submit those now. If not, thanks for attending. If you have anything later, make sure you email us.
I don't see anything coming in here, so I think we'll go ahead and wrap up since we're nearing the end of our time. As Brandon said, if you have any questions after the webinar has ended, please feel free to submit those to msdynamicsevents@gmail.com, and we will always follow up with you there. The session is recorded today and should be available on the Plumline Consulting channel out on YouTube in the future. And if you would like to request a copy of the slide deck today, also feel free to send an email to the msdynamicsevents@gmail.com address, and we can reply to you with a copy of the slide deck. So thanks again, Brandon, for presenting, and to all the attendees for taking time out of your day to attend our Dynamics Downloads webinar. Our next Dynamics Downloads webinar will be on Wednesday, April 17th from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time, and will cover Management Reporter. We will be taking a break in March due to convergence, so we look forward to having you in April. Thanks again, everyone.